Column Clerk.
Is now joining. Unknown participant is now joining.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first PHJ Policy Committee webinar for the fall. Today, Angela Bedard-Haughn from the University of Saskatchewan will be speaking to us about too much, not enough, working with water in prairie soil landscapes. Angela, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Unknown participant is now joining.
Ian, are you able to hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, sorry, I keep getting these little messages that somebody has muted my microphone, and so I'm not quite sure what that's about, but anyway. So I'm here to talk to you today about water in prairie soil landscapes, but I am going to come at it from the perspective of a soil scientist, because that is in fact my background. I'm a professor in the Department of Soil Science here at the U of S, and I've been working with a bit of a specialization in wetland soils for a number of years now. And what I want to talk to you today about is basically what we can learn about water from the soil and how we can use those lessons to manage water in the landscape. And really it comes down to, here in the prairies, we have a fairly distinct set of
participant is now joining,
because we are always needing to deal with either too much water or not enough water or the right amount at the wrong time. And so it's very difficult for us to be able to say, you know, what is the one solution? We can't just implement drainage everywhere. We can't just irrigate everywhere. We don't really know what we're going to see in any given season. And so what can we learn about the landscape by looking at the soil, and how can we use that information to better strategically manage the landscapes that we work within? And so when I spend time in wetland soils, these are some of the things that I come across. And so this very distinctly tells me a story about what has happened in this soil profile. So when I look at soils, they tell me about their history, right? And so that's one of the gifts of podology, or this, it has nothing to do with, you know, feet or children. It has to do with the earth. And so the study of podology is really the study of how soils form and are transformed. And so that allows us to, digging a soil profile and looking at the characteristics of it, it tells us how that soil has formed, what soil forming factors has it experienced, what processes have occurred within there. And indeed, this kind of framework of soil forming factors is how soil scientists developed their kind of schema of soil formation years ago. And it's still how we teach today. So when I go out in the fall and I'm teaching field courses, this is still the framework. I'm in fact giving a final exam to some grad students this afternoon, and it's got 3 questions, and basically each of them has to do with one of these soil forming factors. And so when we think about soil forming factors, you may have learned them as being, if you've ever heard of these before, you may have heard them associated with a guy named Hans Jenny. Here in the prairies, I like to talk about Joe Ellis's soil forming factors. He came up with them around the same time as Hans Jenny, but he was working here on the prairies. And so he includes an important one to our
unknown participant is now joining,
not associated with, that we don't normally see associated with Jenny's factors. And so factors that determine the soil type or group, this is sometimes listed in as an equation, where the soils are a function of their climate, so that both the temperature and moisture regime, and that's both the broader regional climate variability as well as the microclimate within that particular field. The vegetation and other animals that influence, or what's often referred to broadly as organisms. The parent material that the soils are forming in, is it a sandy deposit deposited by glacial-fluvial running water, so running glacial meltwater, or is it the bottom of an old glacial lake, so like the soils around Regina or Winnipeg, where the soil is found in relationship to topography. So is it at the bottom of a hill, the top of a hill, the presence or absence of groundwater, crucial throughout the prairie pothole region. the age of the soil. So a lot of our soils compared to soils, say in California, are very young. So all of our soils have formed since the last ice age. And then in the case of cultivated soils and increasingly other types of management, what is the influence of humans? And so this was the framework that Ellis laid out in the 30s. Yenny's was put out around the same time. But just keep all of these pieces in mind, because when we start talking about how we deal with soils in wet landscapes, a lot of these factors then come into play. So when we look at a soil, it's going to tell us what factors, how those are in place, have been in place historically in that soil profile. And it will also give us some clues. You know, how might we best manage this soil based on its characteristics? And so if we kind of put all of this together, we've often, when we approach prairie pothole landscape, we think about a fairly typical katina as looking something like this, where we've got regosolic soils on the knolls. So these are soils that don't have much of a B horizon. They're pretty weakly developed. Chernozemic soils coming down the back slope region in the middle here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we would have chernozemic soils down in through here. You can see that at the bottom. And then we would have wetland soils, which we call our glysols, associated with, you guessed it, the wetland position. So you can see, though, if we were to do a long trench that allowed us to look at all of these soils at the same time, this cross section that we're looking at here, we would see a progressive thickening of the topsoil or A horizon. And as we move down slope, the whole profile would get, the colored part here would get thicker. And as we got into the wet part, we'd start to see evidence of prolonged standing water in this more central position within the wetland basin. And so we can drill down even further within that. If we look at those wetland soils, there are different types. And this is one of our first clues where we can start to, just by looking at the soil, get a little bit of a clue in terms of what's been going on within that wetland in terms of the hydrology that it's seen historically. And what's really interesting about this is that these imprints that we see in the soil, they're there regardless of what the condition is in any given year. And so we could be in the middle of a drought, and I could go out and take a look at these different wetland soils and be able to tell you what its dominant hydrologic regime has been based on the imprint that leaves on the soil profile. So if we have what we call a recharge soil, so this would be one that's dominated by downward movement of water within the soil profile, it might experience prolonged saturation because the water stands there for quite a while, but it is draining downwards, and we're seeing depression-focused groundwater recharge here. And so we can see by looking at the soil profile, this little E here tells us that and the T in the horizon underneath, basically, I can tell by looking at that description that as we move down through this profile, we can see evidence that the soil has been flushing downwards and moving with that some of the clays that would have been in this upper horizon down into the lower horizon. We can also note that there's no calcium carbonate present in this part of the soil profile because we don't see this CA designation. And so again, this tells us there's a strong downward movement of water here. You might be going, hey, but you've got calcium carbonates over here on the edges. Some of you might be familiar with the idea of a rego ring soil or a willow ring soil, but essentially the groundwater that is recharging down here, you end up with a bit of a groundwater mound forming, and then that leads to groundwater zone of localized groundwater discharge around the edges of these. So again, just by looking at these soil characteristics, we can tell what's been happening in terms of the groundwater predominantly over time. Another example here would be a discharge soil, and this is where we would end up with saltier water in the pond itself. And then underneath that pond throughout, we would see a high presence of calcium carbonates and salts, because these are minerals that are commonly associated with our parent material, our glacially derived parent material. Lots of salts associated with that. And if those are hanging out here throughout the profile, even right underneath the center of the basin, that tells us something about the historical water regime. It tells us that the groundwater most of the time is close enough to the surface here that it never gets a chance to really flush out. And we'll also notice that there's not a whole lot of profile development here. So there's actually, there's a B horizon. We normally, when we classify soils, we have an A, B, and C horizon. When you don't have a B horizon, it tells you again that there's been not a lot of opportunity for downward water movement within this profile. Another clue that we have when we dig a soil profile and we don't see a B horizon. Why is that? And so we can start to figure out that story from the soil. And just to be clear, this is when I talk about at the outset, there's a reason that in the title I talk about soil landscapes, because all of these different soil types, even the different types of wetlands, you might see all of them, and often do see all of them, within a single landscape or within a single farmer's field. Okay, so if we have a hummocky kind of landscape like this, we might see a recharge wetland at the upper portion of the landscape. So just a little bit more at the height of land, or the higher part of the overall watershed. And so this is where we've got that downward movement of groundwater. This dashed line is showing us the depth to calcium carbonate. So where the calcium carbonates that would have been present in the original parent material have been flushed out underneath this wetland. They're a little closer to the surface and the rest of the landscape, depending on how far the water has moved down within it. Down here, we would see the dominantly discharge wetland. So again, the groundwater table would be quite, the groundwater table would be quite close to the surface here. And so we end up with the salts throughout. And this in-between position, this is one that would be a bit more of a chameleon. And so if we were to look at its characteristics, it would probably look a little bit more like a recharge wetland if we didn't dig too deep, but it's maybe not flushing as far. It's still going to have that lateral discharge ring. So it's going to, it would classify out as in soil classification as a recharge type wetland, but it would, depending on how shallow, in years where the groundwater, like we had earlier in this decade, where we had a very shallow groundwater table, it might be more prone to discharge characteristics, but in drier periods, it would function more like a recharge wetland. So it's a little bit more back and forth. And so these are sometimes called flow-through wetlands. There's other terms used to describe them as well. I'm just trying to get that out of my way, sorry. So when we think about that, we think about the range of different types of wetlands that we've got, and we start to think, okay, so what does this mean in terms of agriculture, water management challenges for agriculture? So some of the major challenges that we face are, of course, salinity. So a lot of farmers that have a lot of water around, for all the reasons that I've mentioned in terms of the original salts present in our parent material, with not just calcium carbonate, but a lot of the sodium, magnesium, calcium sulfates, for example. All of these salts might be contributing to plant growth issues. Certainly, when we're dealing with wetland or landscapes that have a lot of wetlands that are that can't be worked in the spring, they often end up as major hosts of weeds and pathogens. So a lot of farmers, particularly when we have wetter years, there's a lot of concerns that basically the wetlands become hotbeds for weed seeds that then disperse throughout the fields. There are also places where pathogens can be harbored and then spread throughout. Site access in spring, when we're talking about wet landscapes, so whether that's that results in unseeded acres in some springs, can be a real problem for farmers. Mid-season flooding, so certain types of soil landscapes are more prone to this than others, so that can result in crop loss after the crop has come up. But then, of course, navigating with large equipment as well. So if we've got a landscape that's got a whole bunch of wetlands, and farmers now, because they have such large farms, have gone to larger equipment, and then they're trying to deal with these massive implements in a field that is peppered with wetlands, and it can be really hard for them in order to kind of move around that and kind of inefficient, right, if they're spending all their time dodging wetlands. So a little bit of interesting thing to kind of think about from that perspective, especially if you're not a producer yourself. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of these issues. So just to mention salinity, salt types, and sort of some of their solubility. So I mentioned a couple times now lime or calcium carbonate, and so this is present throughout most of our prairie soils. Basically, as the glaciers were advancing across the landscape, they were picking up and churning up all of the material and rocks and sediments in their path. And as they were advancing across the prairies, there was a large limestone deposit, basically in a portion of Manitoba, the current Manitoba border. And so that as they picked that up and sort of ground it up and churned it up into the mass of the ice, then when the ice melted and the tills were deposited across the landscape, then there was all this calcium carbonate deposited with it. And so it's kind of present everywhere. It doesn't tend to be a major issue for plant growth, in no small part because it's not that soluble. It's really useful for us in terms of understanding the story that the soils are telling, because that slow solubility means that it gradually moves down through the profile. We can get a sense of how that dominant historical direction of water movement. And so that's one. But the ones that we're a little bit more concerned about in terms of management issues are the more soluble salts. And so gypsum is orders of magnitude more soluble than calcium carbonate, but it's not insanely soluble. And so we do tend to see this. It'll very often, when we think about salts coming up from the groundwater towards the soil surface, it will often precipitate out a little deeper in the profile, unless we're in an extremely strong discharge situation. And it's more these really highly soluble ones that kind of will tend to flush in and out of the rooting zone depending on your current moisture regime. So in recent years, when we've had a lot of, a few years ago when we were having a lot of very shallow groundwater tables, there was a lot of these very soluble salts that were suddenly coming up and being deposited closer to the surface, creating a lot more salinity issues. Whereas when the water table is further down, these are the salts that are more readily flushed down out of the rooting zone and deposited and precipitate below that depth where they're going to be problematic for plant growth. But this is one of the things that's really where it becomes really important to understand your groundwater regime and your potential risk for introducing these soluble salts into your production system. So on the left here, you see some red samphire, that nice white crust. So it looks very festive, the kind of red and white themes there, but really this would be toxic to only to anything except for the most salt tolerant species. And there are extreme cases where we've got not just any type of salts, but high sodium salts, where we can end up with these very dense solonetzic B horizons, which create their own whole host of management issues. And then you tend to see other types of salts associated with these within this field as well. But this very dense B is another extreme type of management issue that tells you something else as well. So when it's too wet, one of the management, so we might be dealing with salinity, but so one of the things that folks will often turn to try and address some of the issues around excessive moisture is drainage. And so whether this is surface drainage or tile drainage, subsurface. And so a big pro is that you can get on the land earlier. There's less risk of in-season flooding and fewer wetlands to work around. And the big thing for a lot of producers, certainly in large parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta, is that very often the wetland soils are some of the very best soils in the field. They've got higher organic matter, higher nutrient contents. They've got more water available just because they're the lowest position in the landscapes. Water runs downhill, and they tend to be a little bit moister. And so if there's not too much water, these are the soils in these sloughs or wetlands, as long as they dry out.
Unknown participant is now joining.
By the time you go to do the seeding, you're in good shape. Some of the cons, though, if in terms of cons of drainage, is the risk of downstream effects. So water quality downstream, Lake Winnipeg is sort of the classic example. Also neighbor relations. So it's not unusual for there to be one farmer who is draining the water off of their landscape, and the neighbor is saying, hey, look, because you've drained that, now you're creating more water issues for me. And then the other losses of wetland services, so loss of biodiversity, for example. If you drain a wetland, then you're cultivating right through it. It becomes part of the monoculture of the field, and so you're losing biodiversity. And from a farming perspective, you're potentially losing one of the bits of habitat for your pollinators as well. One of the questions I asked a few years ago was whether or not drainage was bad for the soil. And so I had a student named Robin Brown who did some work down around the Smith Creek area. And fundamentally, when she looked at nutrient levels and organic carbon, the big things that she found, first of all, if we look at the right here in terms of soil organic carbon, there was some loss certainly of organic carbon associated with in the near surface soil. So if we look, this is depth down the y-axis here, and carbon in the x-axis. And so if we take a look here at our undrained soils, that's the filled circle. So the undrained soil at the top right is quite high at the surface, and then it decreases sharply, which is very typical of a soil profile. Higher carbon at the surface, because that's where the maximum organic matter inputs are, and then it decreases with depth. If we look at our soils that have been drained for the longest period of time, the carbon at the surface is lower, but we actually see higher carbon at depth. And so part of this is basically just showing us that this is, when we're measuring soil carbon from the surface going down, this is demonstrating that there's been...
Unknown participant is now exiting.
While there's been a loss of carbon at the surface, there has been, there appears to be higher carbon at depth, and this has to do with soil redistribution. So tillage erosion is essentially causing carbon to accumulate at depth. On the other hand, if we look at ammonium, we tend to see higher ammonium levels in the near surface and than in any of the drained wetlands. But a big reason for this, you might look at that and go, oh, this is bad, we're losing all of our nitrogen. Bottom line is, in the case of the undrained soil here, nitrogen is hanging out in the ammonium form because it tends to be, undrained soils tend to have lower oxygen levels, not enough oxygen for a whole lot of nitrification to occur. Because if we look at nitrate over here, there's lower nitrate levels in the undrained wetland as well. So bottom line, there was there's a near surface loss of carbon in these in the drained wetlands, but really a lot of that has to do with redistribution. And it's not that the drainage itself is bad for the soil. It's just that you're taking on cultivation, which has all of the known effects on carbon. Nothing else was really stood out in terms of patterns. But of course, it's not always too wet, right? The last couple of years, it's been, we've had more issues surrounding too dry or too much water at the wrong time. And so we need to kind of think about, well, drainage was very in vogue there for a few years. Now we need to think, I think this is a good opportunity for us to think, okay, how can we come up with more resilient management strategies? So maybe we start talking, if we are still talking about drainage, maybe we're talking about gated drainage channels like we have here. So you can shut the gate, hang on to the water, and either let it go when you're sure you don't need it, or you can hang on to it a little bit longer, and there's good evidence that allows some of the potential for downstream nutrient losses to be allayed. So there's a number of opportunities here associated with it being too dry and managing your drainage for variable conditions. But looking beyond that, I mean, some of the other things that we face, so really when I think about water management challenges here, as much as I've worked in wetland soils, there is a recognition that we have a lot of areas of the province where it is traditionally too dry, or the soils themselves tend to be too dry. And so maybe we need to be thinking about there's a lot of discussion around the potential for expanding irrigated acres in Saskatchewan, for example. Maybe we should be making sure that while we're doing that, we're thinking about the most efficient ways to use those water resources as well. So if we're applying irrigation, should we be looking at using precision irrigation? So I had a student here, Jay Bauer, he was working with Warren Helgeson and I, looking at how do you delineate zones where you might add more or less water. He was doing this work down by Outlook, Saskatchewan. And essentially he had a field where if you look at the graph along the bottom, that's essentially showing you the soil profiles, all the soil locations that he sampled. And so you can see those yellow bars at the top of each of the soil profiles. That's a sand deposit. So this is adjacent to an active dune area, and so there's a bunch of sand deposited at the surface. And then if we look at the top, we can see in terms of this water stress index, all these same zones, so this is the transect that you're seeing across the bottom, the same zones that have the sandy deposit at the surface also have the greatest issues with water stress. Same thing if we look at the NDVI measures. And then there's areas of the field as well where there's some plant stress over here. And in that case, it's associated more so with some of the salinity issues at the site. And so we can start to think about, when we think about landscape management, we're not just thinking about how to get rid of water, but in some landscapes, maybe we're thinking about what are the areas where we need more water, but being responsible insofar as we don't want to add, just because these few spots need more water, we don't want to add more water everywhere because we might end up exacerbating the salinity in the downslope area. So maybe we can use precision irrigation, the kind of techniques that we have now, to add more water just in the zones where it's needed and not over apply, not exacerbate the salinity natural tendencies in some areas of the field. And I just want to take a moment here and put a plug in. So that wasn't a drainage joke, it just kind of came out that way. But if it's dry, it's benefits of ZeroTill. And so just as another management strategy, just keeping in mind that we do have some, in drier periods in our history, ZeroTill has more than proven its worth. So in terms of its ability to retain more organic matter, more macronutrients, more microbial biomass and earthworms, enhancing your soil compaction and aggregate stability, more water infiltration and retention, and less plant stress in hot and dry weather. These are all the benefits that have been proven in terms of conservation tillage. And so we just want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind as all of the next new exciting toys come out, that we do still have some things in our toolkit that are designed for these types of conditions. And so the last little bit I want to talk to you guys about today is, so I've talked about what soils can tell us about the history of a landscape, its hydrologic history. I've talked to you about some of the challenges that are associated with too much water in terms of accessing and moving around the field, some of the strategies, and in terms of salinity, and with drainage being the most typical strategy for dealing with that. Talk to you a little bit about dry soils and some of the challenges that some of the ways we can manage for that and manage smartly in terms of precision irrigation or conservation tillage. But now I just want to talk to you a little bit about how we approach or think about wetlands in soils in particular.
Is now exiting.
And so there was a story back in the spring here by Les Henry talking about pretty little sloughs. So are all pretty little sloughs a problem? And I think a lot of times wetland soils get a bit of a bad rep for that. And it's important for us to recognize the multitude of ecosystem services that are associated with that. And so I suspect for this particular audience, I'm kind of preaching to the choir in terms of slough and wetland ecosystem services. I mentioned already there's some of the best soils in the landscape, and that's because they're so, being at the bottom of the slope, they accumulate a lot of water, and along with that, a lot of nutrients, tend to be very biologically active, which is great for both nutrient cycling, as well as the filtration and essentially cleaning and purification of water. I've talked about groundwater recharge, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and of course, carbon sequestration. And so carbon sequestration, we did some work at St. Denis where we basically found that if we have uncultivated wetlands, so ones that have not been tilled, those in the St. Denis region overall, not just at the wildlife area, but uncultivated wetlands occupied only 11% of the research area we were looking at, but contained 23% of the soil organic carbon in the site as a whole. So relatively small proportion of the landscape with a huge impact in terms of carbon storage. And so there's lots of good reasons for us to think, hey, what is happening in these wetlands and how can we manage for the ecosystem services? Even if that carbon is buried somewhere at depth, like we see here, the gray line, there's big carbon bulges, that have been buried at depth through historical instability. This is all part of the soil landscape that we not want to manage for, and do what we can to kind of preserve and protect that carbon in place. Other ecosystem services I mentioned in terms of the biological importance of these things, one of them is that they help hold on to things so that they don't become a bigger problem elsewhere in the landscape. And so Annemieke Fahrenhorst, her lab group, did some work looking at herbicide sorption and found that these BTG horizons were some of the best ones for attenuation of select agrochemicals, particularly for glyphosate. And so if we look at the glyphosate, the amount of glyphosate that these soils are holding on to, these BTG horizons up here, these are the ones that I was saying we see associated with our recharge wetlands. So the T tells us that there's a lot of clay associated with that. The G tells us that it's got prolonged water saturation. So as water carrying these agrochemicals is going into these profiles, it's essentially getting caught up in that BT horizon and so attenuated there. And hopefully over time, then it's breaking down before it becomes a problem elsewhere. They're also really key for phosphorus retention, and in particular, the ones that are high in calcium carbonate. We've found that the carbonate-rich wetland soils can actually hold on to quite a bit more of the total phosphorus. So we found that carbonate-rich soils, they hold a total. Sorry, I'll back up. They have a similar ability for concentration of total phosphorus. So if we measure all the phosphorus in carbonate-rich wetland soils, ones that have a lot of calcium carbonate versus ones that don't, the carbonate-deficient ones, they might have a similar concentration. But in terms of the amount of water extractable phosphate, so this is the stuff that's at risk of going downstream, the carbonate deficient soils tend to have a lot more water extractable phosphorus because we've got calcium phosphates forming here. And so that is a less mobile form of phosphorus. And so that ends up being less available to go down slope or downstream than the carbonate deficient soils. So lots of exciting stuff happening in these wetland soils. And another kind of added bonus to this, remembering that sometimes not all salts are bad, because for those of us that have spent time working in the greenhouse gas realm, we know that when we've got soils that are relatively high in sulfate salts, which, as I mentioned earlier, that's a lot of our soluble salts, that sulfate salts can actually help suppress methane emissions, because basically the sulfates are preferentially reduced before we get to in terms of the sequence of the energetic. It's more energetically favorable for microorganisms to use sulfur as their terminal electron acceptor. And so I had a grad student here who's looking at different salt concentrations, no added salt, and then salts, increasing the salt groundwater concentration to 6 and 12 millisiemens per centimeter. And if we just focus here on the methane emissions in the middle, we see that at his one site that had no background salinity, there was actually, when the water, under saturated conditions, that one with no background salinity and no added salt, this control column here, had the highest methane emissions compared to either the other site, which had background salinity, or that same non-saline site with added salt levels. And so it was a very tangible and distinct controlled experiment demonstrating that influence on those in those soils. And so what can we do to kind of manage these wetlands so that people aren't so in such a rush to drain them? Certainly one of the things we can think about is, are there ways that we can work with our riparian zones? And so these are often marginal land because of the increased moisture or salinity. So this same student that I just showed you the salt graph, he was looking at whether short rotation willow could be grown. And so, using that both as a buffer to help prevent certain chemicals from getting into the wetland, But if we were to, if we move more into the bioenergy space, this same short rotation willow could be cut and harvested for feedstock. This is where willows naturally grow, is in this riparian zone. And so can we get some benefit out of using these zones differently? And one of the other pieces I often think about, and some of you may have heard me present on this kind of concept once or twice before, because I try to get it out there wherever I can, is what is our opportunity for thinking bigger? So when we think about working with wetlands and water in the prairie soil landscape, are there opportunities for us to think beyond, boy, that wetland is a pain and I don't want to have to drive my giant tractor and implements around it. I think I'm going to drain it, or I'd really like those acres back. I'm just going to drain all of the wetlands in my soil into that slough over there on that big slough over on the back 40 and forget about it. Because when we think about wetland soils and those ecosystem services that I was just talking about, you know, it's one thing to preserve a single wetland to grow willow around, or a couple of wetlands to grow willow around. But if we want to benefit from the whole suite of ecosystem services associated with wetlands and wetland soils, can we think bigger and think about strategic retention and restoration? Because quite frankly, we're never going to find, when we look at that sometimes razor edge, where we're trying to balance the needs of food security and the needs of water security, how can we allow farmers to access most of their land, or effectively manage their land, while still preserving some of the characteristic opportunities for wetland ecosystem services? And we know from our work that we've done at various wetland soils that not all wetlands do the same things. And so even when if we think about what I've just talked to you about here today, we know that there's recharge and discharge wetlands. Each of those is doing something different. The recharge wetlands are good for groundwater recharge and for purification of water and for holding on to pesticides, getting those out of the system. Those discharge wetlands, those are the ones that tend to have more salts, so there's a risk associated with that, but those salts also can help suppress methane emissions. And we also, the discharge wetlands also tend to have more calcium carbonate associated with them, and so those the calcium carbonate can kind of help retain some of the phosphorus and keep it from draining downstream. And so is there a balance that we could find of, if we've got a landscape that's got a combination of recharge and discharge wetlands, can we think strategically about a suite of wetlands, perhaps along a wetland corridor, and so that we protect a string of wetlands that is maybe only interconnected during the wettest of years? So if we look at the figure on the right here, the pink, this is a little backwards in perhaps in your mind, but the pink is actually the ponds. And the blue is all of the area showing how these different ponds would be connected hydrologically if the water were to, if these wetlands were to fill up and spill over one into the other. And so what if we were to, instead of just protecting, the big one down here and draining everything into it, what if we were to protect and set aside a stream, a connected corridor of wetlands, and allow for a certain amount of drainage into that corridor? And so Bob Clark is on the call, probably looking at this going, you can't drain any of that because that's St. Denis National Wildlife Area, but you get the picture here. So we could have a wetland corridor draining here. And so that would reduce the downstream flooding risk if we were able to kind of keep some of this water retained in this landscape. We would increase our attenuation of nutrients and pesticides within a field. We would have then these wetter periods these wetter kind of corridors that would serve as beetle banks, or that would allow habitat for wildlife, and including our and as well as for pollinators. But if we're preserving a wetland corridor, then this area then becomes much more accessible for large equipment to work. Just an example of something we could throw out there and start to think bigger. Now, it is going to create some challenges if we start talking about manipulating the hydrology. We need to make sure we understand that, and there's a lot of great work going on here at the Global Institute for Water Security, trying to get a handle on that. We need to be aware of where that might increase risk for salinization. Certainly if we're using these wetlands to kind of hold on to sediments and nutrients and chemicals, we'll need to watch for excessive buildup of that. And there's still going to be some risk of invasion of exotic species. But if we have enough information, we're better equipped to kind of deal with these, to start to think, okay, plan ahead. Now let's follow this scenario through. What would happen if we were to create this wetland corridor, and what would that look like? Now, in order to maximize the net benefits across the landscape, we need to make sure that we know where the wetland soils and where the wetlands are, or where they were at least. So if we go through a restoration exercise, how can we prioritize which ones to either restore or retain? And so one of the challenges we have, though, is identifying those. And so certainly our colleagues in Ducks Unlimited have been doing a lot of work trying to identify these, trying to figure out where in the topography and hydrology where the different wetlands might have been. But we also need to recognize that diversity of wetlands, if we want to maximize net benefits, we also want to try and capture a diversity of the texture of the mineralogy, a wide range of wetland size, permanence, and function. Because a little ephemeral pond is going to do something different than a larger semi-permanent or permanent one. If we want to maximize our net benefits or our diversity of benefits, we want to capture a range of wetland chemistry. So some of those high sulfur wetlands, great for suppressing methane emissions, but they also suppress other types of activity as well. So maybe we want to make sure we've got a mixture there. And recognizing that climate variability leads to variable connectivity, and how does that impact our management decision? One of the big challenges we have if we want to go through and pick out locations to do these types of wetland corridors, though, is how can we make decisions without all of the information? And so where are the sloughs, or where were the sloughs? And we really need this big picture in order to make responsible management decisions. So we can't just use a single observation of water level. So again, looking at St. Denis here, we've got, this would be in 2012 when we have a fair bit of water. This is a satellite image. But if we were to base where the wetlands are on this image versus on this 1968 air photo, we would have a very different sense of the maximum possible extent of some of these ponds, or even their very existence of some of them. We might think that they never actually held enough water if we were just to look at this 1968 picture versus if we were to look at the 2012. We can't use a single observation of water level. And it would be great if we could just use the soil surveys. So the Saskatchewan Soil Information System down here has all of this information queryable online. So you can look at a bunch of information about, this is an example of areas these are the different polygons that include glycolic soils. Okay, well, that doesn't narrow it down all that much, because it doesn't tell us where exactly the glycols are within a particular polygon, unless it's really, really wet. So this is the only time the soil survey can really give us that information, is in some of these areas. So this is around St. Brew, and so these are areas that are just actually straight up mapped as wetlands in the soil survey. So soil survey is not going to give us all the information we need. It's just not at the right scale or resolution to capture that. And so one of the things that my group's been doing is work with predictive soil mapping. So like I said, the soils can tell us where the water has been. And so because we understand how soils form within the landscape, we can use select point measurements, covariates, environmental covariates that capture the topography and ideally some measure of how water would move across that landscape. And then we can convert that into maps of both soil type and soil properties. So I won't go into all the different methods here, but just know that we've got these techniques that allow us to do that. And so it allows us to take our soil survey information from a scale that looks like this for 4/4 sections of land, that it just shows a couple of wetlands here, and then this whole area is mapped as one soil association. And then this other little corner is another association. And so we know that based on this map, we know there's 6 or 7 soil types associated with these 4/4 sections, but we don't know where they are within the landscape. And digital soil mapping or predictive soil mapping allows us to get to this scale where we can now say, okay, these blue spots, that's where the wetlands are. And we can also say, here's the other types of different types of soils based on our understanding of how they're distributed across the landscape and the predictive soil mapping techniques. So it allows us to get to a scale where we can actually start to make informed decisions. Okay, and so this is another example of not just where it's allowing us to make understand where the wetlands are, but Jeremy Kiss, a student of mine, actually was able to take that one step further and even use that information to start to distinguish the different types of wetlands within the landscape. So where would we see fresh or recharge water associated with the wetlands, and where might we see the ones that are higher in salts, so the more of the discharge type wetlands. And so then that, again, if we're wanting to create wetland corridors and we know we want to capture different ecosystem services associated with these different wetland types, this type of information is really useful. So big thing, if we're trying to work with crazy water in the prairie soil landscapes, the first step is to take a closer look at our wetlands, figure out what we've got, inventory. And so whether that's using some of the information from ducks, whether it's using predictive soil mapping techniques, most likely some combination, all of the above. Inventory your wetlands, figure out what you've got, the good, the bad, the ugly, what are the different services that they can provide. The next step is to really manage for what you've got and try and think about net benefits across the whole field. So I've given this presentation to a couple of different audiences now. So if we're wanting to maximize net benefits, your answer to that, your first instinct might be, I want to preserve biodiversity and habitat, or it might be, I want to maximize yield. Can we start to think about this as non-binary and try and maximize net benefits? But how can we maximize food production and maximize biodiversity, finding sort of the best compromise between the two? And the last piece here really comes down to the wildness or the unpredictability, the variability of these landscapes. When we are dealing with excess water, it can be really easy to say, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and drain. But are there nimbler management options? So whether it's gated drainage or whether it's wetland corridors, are there opportunities to do things differently? They're a little bit more forward thinking and will allow us to be more resilient in these highly variable times. So I acknowledge a whole number of folks whose information was shared here today, as well as the funders who made all of these various projects possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Ian, and we can have a little bit more discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Angela. If anybody has any questions, could you please just put them in the chat box?
Unknown participant is now exiting.
All right.
Karen Raven
is now exiting.
We have a question here. For predictive soil mapping, do you require LiDAR for accurate topography and elevation?
LiDAR is wonderful if you have it. So certainly we've done a lot of work that does have LiDAR. We've also
Unknown participant is now exiting.
We've also done the work with drone collected topography. So actually the example map that I showed you was done basically just using a surface map that was derived from drone flight.
Is now exiting.
So LiDAR is nice, but it's not entirely necessary if you have the other access.
Okay, he just says, thank you for your that. I guess if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, either come up with online or, oh, okay, Anna, go ahead. All right. With land ceded to perennial cover, there are a lot more opportunities to preserve and restore wetlands. Is there a percentage we should try to restore?
I think a percentage, I think it's more of a understanding the balance across a region. And so in terms of, so you're talking about a percentage of wetlands to try to restore within the perennial landscape? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. So within a perennial landscape, then I think the question I would ask is if there's any benefit, what you might be wanting to drain for. So I would say that in the case of a perennial landscape, if you're not needing to worry as much about navigating with equipment and that type of thing, that you're going to want to maximize your retention as much as possible. Beyond that, I think the magic number is going to depend on. So if we assume that you do still need to navigate, for bailing or what have you, and that there is a concern, I think then your magic number is really going to depend on your local hydrology and conditions and kind of concerns. Because if you've got a relatively level landscape, as an example, that's really prone to flooding, or a really heavy clay landscape, then that's going to have one set of concerns. If you've got a really a lot of perennial landscapes might have other issues associated with that in terms of sandier soils, and you might be wanting to maximize your wetland retention just to keep more water in that system to sustain your growth. So there's a number of kind of trade-offs there where I wouldn't want to say one specific number without thinking about the specific landscape characteristics.
All right. Wondering if you can comment on potential for carbon sequestration on restored wetlands. Do you think they could get back to levels before drainage, 11 to 23%? And any idea on the term to get there?
So there's some interesting work that's been done in the last few years on this, and so I think it depends on how they're being restored. And so, for restoring ones that have been previously drained, if I assume we're talking about restoring versus constructing, because those are two different things. So sometimes people will interchange the terms. So I'm going to assume we're talking about restoring versus constructing. If it has been a reasonable length of not too long of a period of time since it was initially drained, and it is the vegetative community can be effectively restored, I do think that they can get back to that higher level. If we start talking about a constructed wetland, that's something quite different, because constructed wetlands, we often just think, well, we'll just dig a hole and put some water in it and it's going to become a wetland. And there's a lot more of the biological complexity and the need for organic matter to kind of kickstart all of the processes that are part of the soil processes that are part of the wetland ecosystem services. You need to be able to maximize that. So I do think that it is possible to get back to those levels if we're restoring a wetland where we know we can look at the soil profile and say, yes, this was a fully functional wetland at one point in its history. I think it is possible. Constructed wetlands requires a lot more thought and careful design.
Okay, thank you. And here's the next question is, I deal with landowner conflict on landscape, conflict between landowners who want to either maximize their yield or maximize the aesthetic value of their property by way of wetland restoration. In one case, restoration of a wetland has directly impacted a farmer. The farmer is flooded out. What do you propose as a strategy from a soil prescription perspective?
Okay, so you've got one landowner then who, like adjacent landowners, one has restored it, and now that's creating an issue for the neighbor. Is that what you're saying? Okay, so in this case, I think there's a couple of approaches that could be taken here. So I think it's the landowner who has restored their wetland, is it actually flooding the neighbor's landscape now? Okay, so I think in this context, that's one where if it is a restoration, then the landowner who has actually restored the wetland, that's within their right. If they're actually so if it's one where that had previously been drained and they're restoring it and now it's flooding the neighbor, that's the one who's restored it is probably okay to go. But the neighbor who I think is now the neighbor who has the flooding issues, the question would become, can there be some selective management here? So either where the neighbor who has now lost that land to flooding, are they able to, can they potentially work together to, I'm thinking about some of the things I've seen in the Smith Creek area. Can they landscape that? Can they restore, or can they manage their half of it a little bit differently? I'm thinking about it would depend a little bit on the underlying landscape, because there's at Saint Denis, right now there's a meta pond that underneath that has a series of smaller wetlands. And so it may be that if you manage that the landowner on the flooded side may be able to drain a portion of that and effectively keep their side a little bit separate with a bit of strategic management. The other possibility then would be to explore some of these other management strategies in terms of saying, okay, can we put in something that is extraordinarily thirsty or manage for the riparian zone? So it sort of depends on the size of the area, and I would say on the underlying landscape. So what's underneath the newly flooded area? If the whole wetland essentially was the low part is on the fence line, that's going to be one issue. If it's a series of smaller wetlands that just happened with the neighbor who restored it happens to be flooding over into the other neighbor, that's a little bit different strategy. So I'd want to look at a topographic map for the area, maybe think a little bit about how the water would move across that landscape. And then I think your options are going to depend a little bit on where and how the water might move. And is there anything you can do to support the farmer on the flooded side, or does that individual now need to think a little bit about other ways they could use that portion of their landscape as well?
Okay. Are there examples where wetlands should not be restored, ignoring the improved ag economics and impacts off the land?
Ignoring the improved ag. So let me think. That's a good question. I just want to think carefully before I answer. I do think this is an example of where, like actually the example that Anna just had is one where that conversation needs to be had initially, right? So if if Anna's two individuals had that conversation beforehand, it could have prevented some conflict. It may be that there could have been a different strategy in place there rather than the restoration that the one neighbor undertook. So I do think that's one piece. I think it's important to know if you're actually increasing the risk of certain types of downstream contamination. For example, if you're restoring this wetland and now it's becoming part of a connectivity stream where it was actually kind of, you'd somehow managed, if you'd managed to hydrologically isolate it through the way it's been managed. that would be, thereby containing excess chemicals or some other type of spill on the landscape. That would be one example. So I think there probably are examples, and in each case, what you do is you have to play through that scenario, look at what would happen if I restore this wetland. Hydrologically, what would happen within the landscape? Hydrologically, what would happen downstream? And is there anything that I want to prevent from happening? So I would say you need to run through those impact scenarios before you make the decision.
Okay. Another question here. Saskatchewan and Manitoba seem to be moving to a more coordinated surface water management plans based on watersheds and basins. Are you seeing any improvement in water management with this yet?
I don't think much just yet, but I suspect that in time we might get there. We still have a ways to go.
All right. Well, I guess we've now sort of hit our out. Here we go. You mentioned precision irrigation as a management option for when it's too dry. Do you have any comments on whether increasing irrigation capacity within a province will be a viable drought management option into the future, considering predicted future water availability?
So I think this is where precision irrigation becomes really critical, right? So if we're going to be dealing with surface water shortages, then we'll have to be that much more responsible with the surface water that we do apply. So if we're expanding our irrigated acreage, a lot of the crops that we grow, if we do this smart, right, it could help optimally maintain growth in the longer term and essentially keep agriculture sustainable in some parts of the province where it might otherwise become too dry, because a lot of our crops don't need that much water. If we figure like, woohoo, we're irrigating, let's all grow corn and sugar beets, then that's going to be a different kind of challenge, right? So I guess it depends how we use. Its viability depends on how responsibly we use that water, and that we're using kind of precision approaches. So we're just applying the water where needed, as opposed to just flooding everything and growing super thirsty crops just because they're high, just because of their value. So we need to make sure that we're thinking broadly about food security and management in that vein, and in terms of that we don't get sloppy in terms of our landscape management just because we can start to turn on the tap.
All right. This will be, unfortunately, everybody, we are toward the end of our hour. I will do this one last question. If you have any follow-on questions, you can certainly send them to me, and I will forward them on to Angela. Just to follow up to Trevor's question, restoring and increasing the volume.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Of a discharge wetland likely to result in salinity problems moving away from the new wetland. Is the establishment of perennial
is now exiting
the new wetland borders the best way to combat salinity in these areas? Any other ideas?
So yeah, it is going to, if we increase the volume, the amount of water that's in a discharge wetland, then you're presumably going to, the surrounding diameter impacted area of salinity is going to potentially also increase. That being said, that perennial management around it is really key. And so this is where, when you're thinking about the kind of concept I was talking about in terms of wetland corridors, then you're thinking not just about the wetlands themselves, or the ponded area, but about the wetland as a whole, where the wetland encompasses that riparian zone. And so you want to make sure that you're growing something in that riparian zone that will kind of help you contain or manage for that salinity. And so whether that is some of the more, some of the more salt tolerant shrub species or other types of perennial forage that you can then, as part of your management strategy, can actually cut and bale, for example. So there's different kind of approaches that you can take there, but it is something where when you start talking about restoring the discharge positions, you do need to have that other strategy, that kind of overall riparian strategy in mind as well.
Okay. I did get one last question in before I cut off questions, but so I'll give you this, your last question here. In determining net benefits, ES and crop, how can landowners expect help in determining and maximizing the net economic profitability, social license, and future valuation of ES, especially with ephemeral bodies?
So you're looking for, I think this is part of the ongoing conversation. So this is one of the things that needs to be better quantified. So if we have government in place that is providing some value or support for ecosystem services, then we're going to start to maximize those net benefits. Some of them, it's just an understanding. So it's a little bit of a trade-off where we have to quantify not just benefits in terms of, yield benefits, but also some of the, are there yield benefits, quantifiable yield benefits associated with having more pollinators, right? So if you protect your wetlands and you have more pollinators, how much of a balance or an offset of loss do you have there by having more biodiversity? So being able to kind of quantify that. And there is ongoing work in that area to try and assign some numbers to that. Other bits associated with that are just as well the risk mitigation. So going both ways. So if you're doing some selective restoration, right? Or is that going to help you mitigate some of your potential risk for drought conditions in really dry years? If you're keeping some of the water on your landscape, are you going to be less vulnerable to drought? And I'm talking more here in those parts of the province or the Prairie Pothole region where it tends towards semi-arid, but people got excited about drainage when we had 4 or 5 wet years, for example. So it's keeping that longer lens in mind, because I think there's a lot of year-to-year economic variability already, and so we need to kind of keep that risk management as, I think, part of that equation as well. So what is not just ecosystem services in terms of, birds are beautiful, but ecosystem services in terms of buffering risk of associated with variability.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Angela. We appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending today's PHJV webinar. We'll be announcing our next webinar shortly for next month. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.